Greetings, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Without further ado, this topic is going to be one that I'm not sure how many of you are going to like grasp, all the data that I'm putting out there or all the references. So I am sitting down for once. So inshallah ta'ala, if anybody is confused about a concept or about a citation, just make sure that you kind of and comment in the comment section, and I'll try to get to it as soon as I see, inshallah. Okay, so the basic interest that I have with regards to Marcion, because he's not the only early quote unquote heretic that's been studied in Christian scholarship or even by people who are just have a passing interest in early Christianity. There are people who might have left more of like a textual trace for their followers. For example, people like the Manichaeans, right? Their followers like Faustus and others have left a lot more actual, tangible, extant evidence that has been dissected by even later church fathers than people like Marcion. The interest with Marcion is about his primitivity, basically how early his preaching was and how widely accepted it was in all sections of the Christian world. Marcion, his name is, or sometimes referred to as Marcion, because that's how his name is actually spelled. It's with a kappa. So Marcion of Sinope was born in Pontus. Pontus is a country somewhere in Asia, and according to Epiphanius, Epiphanius of Salamis, a church father writing in the middle of the 4th century, a very prominent theologian and historian, regarded very, very highly by both the Christians of the East and Christians of like the Latin West and the Roman Catholics. What he says is that his father preceded him as an actual Orthodox bishop of Pontus, which is very, very important because you know that as a child he actually did get a Christian education. He wasn't someone who just kind of crashed into the scene without any type of prerequisite knowledge or any type of familiarity with Christianity. He actually had a father who was already well connected within Christian orthodoxy. We don't know much about his father. It's just that passing reference by Epiphanius that I know of, at least. But it's enough to show you that if he was in Marcion's life at all, that he would have kind of equipped him with some basic understanding about Christianity. Okay. And so his era of activity is pretty much agreed upon. What's fascinating about Marcion or Marcion is that the early church fathers hardly disagreed with each other concerning key aspects of his life and even about his text, which I'll get to later. And it's something that's not even found within the historiography and the biographies of very important proto-Orthodox church fathers. Usually there's a lot of difference of opinion among them. But basically, Tertullian is the only one who has a dissenting opinion on how long he lived or when his flourishing or his time of activity was. So Justin, Irenaeus, Origen, they basically place him around the year 130 or so, 130 to 140. Tertullian, he has in one of his in basically a section which he wrote against Marcion, he says that he was around, or he flourished during the time of Pope Eleutherius, and he was around like the time of Antoninus Pius, and after that, so around like the year 160. But that's far too late. All of our earlier witnesses, they place him around the year 140. And in fact, Tertullian even contradicts this himself when he says that the Marcionites, they celebrated his coming by they had like a phrase saying that the reviver came 115 years after our Lord. So 115 either after the birth of Jesus or after the death of Jesus. So that would place him anytime between, again, 115 CE to 145 CE. Justin Martyr, in I believe his first apology to the Roman Emperor, he said that even now in his old age, he is still preaching. So Marcion, according to Justin, was already at a very old age, sometime around the year 150 or 160, and theoretically he would have been preaching much earlier than that. So that would put his activity around 130, for lack of a more precise date, because these things are just they're surmised by the totality of evidence that we have. And his following continued all the way until maybe the advent of Islam, until the 7th century. So we have Epiphanius himself writing in the middle of the 4th century. He actually states that um, that even then his followers filled the earth. Even then his followers filled the earth, and that tells you that basically he had followers that were significant enough after the Nicene councils, after all the ecumenical stuff, to consider him like an actual powerhouse of the early Christian movements. And there's actually even a Muslim biographer. His name is El-Nadim, who also commented on him and saying that even now he has followers, Marcionite followers, and he places him under Pius as well, so around the year 140s after the death of Hadrian. So what we know is El-Nadim.
Yeah.
No, did I say 7th century?
I don't know. He said he existed up to the advent of Islam.
No, I said after Islam. Yeah, so it's like 9th century.
Oh wow.
El-Nadim is writing around the 9th century. Yeah, Marcionites still existed.
Yeah. Cool.
And so dating individuals is a very tricky subject. So there are people like Cerinthus and Basilides where we have a whole host of different datings for them. Basically, from Cerinthus is dated anywhere between the 60s to the 100s, which would put him as a contemporary of people like Paul, according to Irenaeus. Basilides, he's placed between 90 and 110, or 100 and 120, and Marcion has a more precise date. So basically around 130, everyone agrees he was already preaching. And what his profession was very interesting. Tertullian and others, they call him a nautes. Nautes meaning a sailor, kind of like Luffy from One Piece. He was a sailor, not a pirate, but a sailor who was very well connected with the Romans. And he actually donated large sums of money to the church, something like I don't know, like the equivalent of maybe like $15,000 today, to at one time to the church. And so he had an influence. He had a means of expediting ideas, and he had a means of movement. And even Justin, in his second apology, he states that the gospel, the Evangelion, or the memoirs of the apostles were in archives all over the Christian world. So the person who had the best means in order to collate them was someone who obviously would not be subject to persecution and to the wars that have been flaring up between the Romans and the basically the Jewish rebels like Bar Kokhba and after him. Right around Marcion's advent, we have the coincidental subjugation of Judaism in the Roman government. And so these were Jewish revolts that appeared everywhere from like the 60s to eventually when they were stamped out by Emperor Hadrian. And so he couldn't have come at a better time, because his ideas, according to these early church fathers, was that the God of the Old Testament was what's called a demiurge. He was a created secondary being, and that he was the one who actually revealed the Old Testament. And that this is why you find such a contrast of ideas within the Tanakh and within the New Testament. Whereas Jesus is all about peace and love and healing and forgiveness, etc., etc. The Old Testament says that it was revealed by Yahweh, by the Lord, by the Tetragrammaton, and yet it's full of rage, it's full of blood, and full of hate and vindictiveness and retaliation, etc., etc. And so he called this the antitheses. He actually prefaced to his collection of the pre-canonical version of Paul's letters and his gospel, which he called the Evangelion, and his collection of Paul's letters, which he called the Apostolos. He prefaced it with an opening called the Antitheses, where he tried to show how these views are not tenable, how they're not harmonious. You cannot be a so-called Christian, because at that time Christianity was not even like known formally, but you can't be a follower of Jesus basically and adhere to a text that flatly contradicts the teachings of Jesus. Although he did, in his Evangelion, affirm some of the statements that were uttered by Jesus, where it talks about his advent and appealing to the Torah, etc., which is why scholars, one of the reasons why scholars like Jason Badun don't think that he tampered with his text at all, because his ideology was so anti-law, antinomian, very much Paul-like. He was a zealous supporter and endorser of Paul's ideas. But even still, his Evangelion is not much different than what we find today in the Gospel according to Luke, outside of a shorter, uh, basically a shorter text that doesn't have the virgin birth or the genealogies or the nativity, which is the first 3 or 4 chapters, and various different either expansions or omissions or differences in text. And I'll get to that later. Why these are not like actual Marcionite innovations? They're actually part of an earlier text that Marcion himself drew from. So his ideology is given to us by people like Tertullian, by people like well, let me actually tell you our sources about Marcion, because we don't have his text, we don't have his Evangelion. Not a shred of it exists outside of a few fragments that some scholars have tried to associate with Marcion's Evangelion, because they're so fragmentary, you don't know what text they came from, but they support the reading of Marcion. For example, there's a manuscript called P69, which has a small, small reference to the Gospel according to Luke, and it's extant enough to where you know that the famous passage of "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do" is missing. It's missing from that text. And so scholars have said perhaps this is something that survives of Marcion's canon, because Marcion didn't have that in his text, according to those church fathers. But that's very hypothetical. It's very speculative. But as far as for certain, we don't have anything that we can identify with Marcion's Evangelion. Well, how we identify it is through a series of sources of people who wrote against him. So, and this is already problematic, as most scholars already admit that freely. Anyone who's done a reconstruction will tell you this is something that scholars have to wrestle with when considering what is actually in his text and what isn't, because what you're relying on is the testimony of his adversaries. So these are people like, of course, Tertullian is our major witness, Epiphanius. There is a dialogue that is attributed to Origen, although some scholars don't think it's actually by Origen, but it's of an early enough date to where they use it. It's called the Dialogue of Adamantius. Then there is Pseudo-Ephraim. Ephraim the Syrian supposedly wrote a dialogue and a refutation of Marcion, Pseudo-Ephraim A. There is an Acts work by Hegemonius called the Acts of Archelaus. And then there are these very enigmatic prologues and epilogues. Prologues to the Gospels that are found in Vulgate manuscripts and in some Western texts of Paul's letters. And these prologues, they're called anti-Marcionite prologues. Scholars date them anywhere from the 2nd to the 4th century, and they preserve very, very old information. It takes too long to go through all the information on that, but suffice to say that information has an origin in very early antiquity, so 2nd century onwards. And these anti-Marcionite prologues, they actually they're addendums to Vulgate manuscripts that are attached to the beginning of the Gospels, and they describe the origin of the Gospels. What we have extant is of Mark, of Luke, and of John. And this is one of the reasons why I actually don't adopt the position that Marcion's Gospel was a earlier form of the Gospel according to Luke. I think it was an earlier form of the Gospel according to Mark. And this is what's called the Hippolytus theory, or the Hippolytus hypothesis. Say that twice fast. Hippolytus hypothesis. Because these anti-Marcionite prologues have a very clear agenda at hand, and only Mark, Luke, and John exist. Okay, Mark, Luke, and John. And Ahmed, if I were to ask you, knowing what we know about Marcion, why do you think the prologues don't include anything about the Gospel according to Matthew? These anti-Marcionite prologues. The content of Matthew is already anti-Marcionite. It is very pro-Jewish, very pro-Jewish. It's called the Jewish Gospel for a reason, right? It's filled with references to the law and how the law won't ever dissipate, and how you should follow everything the scribes and the Pharisees do, for they sit on the throne of Moses, etc., etc.
Matthew or Mark?
Matthew.
Matthew, right? Okay.
Yeah. So these manuscripts that are attached to the beginning of the Gospels, they only exist for Mark, Luke, and John.
Right.
Because Matthew is already known to be anti-Marcionite. This is the theory, and so Matthew, in the opinion of myself and many others, of course, much more erudite, they believe that Matthew's Gospel was an Ebionite interpolation. Basically, they took Marcion's Gospel and then they added Jewishness to it. They took Marcion, or what I would call Mark, and they added the references to the law, the strict observance of the law, of course. Do not go into the Gentiles, right? Do not go into the way that the Gentiles or the Samaritans, calling the Gentiles actual dogs, etc., etc. So Muslims' over-reliance on Matthean texts to kind of like attack Paul and stuff, I don't think is very well founded, because these are, in my opinion, very easily to substantiate as Jewish community interpolations into an earlier text that didn't have any of them. Okay, so the prologue of the Gospel according to Mark says heinous things about Mark. That's why I believe that it is actually Mark's Gospel that Marcion's is based off of. What it says is that it doesn't even contain the positive aspects of Papias' testimony for Mark. All it says is that Mark didn't see Jesus, nor did he walk with him, but he was an interpreter for Peter, and he had very freaky, stubby fingers. It's called calidactylus, which means a person with fingers too small for his body. And of course, this is a very easy way to identify with Mark. Why? Because Mark's text was always seen as the one that was mutilated, because it did not have a resurrection account. And it was used by heretics to say that Jesus wasn't crucified. So the whole shebang, the crucifixion and the resurrection, kind of in dispute with Mark's text. Then it has Luke's prologue, and it's very easy to see again why somebody would attach a prologue for Luke, because Luke was seen as the original Marcion, the original Evangelion which Marcion reduced from. So it's filled with flowing praise that he was actually a Gentile, that he was a physician, he was the true follower of Paul, and not Marcion. Marcion also credits his gospel to be directly from Paul. He says that this is the Evangelion that the Apostolos himself preached, and the gospel and the anti-Marcionite prologue flips that on its head. And the longest prologue is dedicated to Luke, although he himself was not a disciple, and yet there's no mention of saying, he did not walk with the Lord, nor see him, or any of its deficiencies like they did with Mark. And then for John is one of the most interesting ones. It actually includes Marcion in the story. It says that Papias used to write at the dictation. This is one of the renderings of the Latin of John's anti-Marcionite prologue, and scholars have rendered it differently. But basically, it includes a statement that either Papias was the scribe of John, and he used to write down the true gospel, and then he became aware of the contradictions of Marcion, which is like antitheses. This is the Latin word that is the equivalent of antitheses. Then he became aware of the contradictions of Marcion, and he expelled him. So Marcion is alive at the time of John. And we have church fathers all throughout, like Philastrius, who affirms this. Philastrius says that Marcion actually was himself opposed by John the Apostle. And the calidactylus, the short, stubby-fingered report, is also mentioned by Hippolytus and others. So it's very early, even though the manuscripts are from the Vulgate, so 5th century on. These are very early reports. And it says that John expelled him, even though Marcion was a courier between John and the apostles. Marcion himself used to be the middleman between John and the apostles. And this is the anti-Marcionite prologues, in my opinion, justifying how Marcion could actually make a New Testament, how he could actually make a gospel that is so harmonious with the synoptics. And that, yes, sir.
Just for the layman, and if you can maybe rephrase, what do you mean by Marcionite prologues? What does that essentially entail?
These are anti-Marcionite prologues.
Right.
So in the Latin Vulgate tradition, there exists dozens of manuscripts that have introductions to them. So the Gospel according to Mark would be introduced by this prologue, and they all have an anti-Marcionite tinge. So scholars have labeled them the anti-Marcionite prologues. The Gospel according to Luke would have also this prologue that's attached to it. The Gospel according to John would also have that prologue. But the Gospel according to Matthew in the Vulgate was not given this prologue, because it was already seen as anti-Marcionite by nature. It was already well understood that this was a polemic against Marcion.
There you go. Okay. Understood. And you have another question in the chat as well. Are you suggesting that Mark's original gospel ends earlier than chapter 15? Or do you mean chapter 16, Mitchell? Mark's
original... he's talking about the crucifixion or the resurrection appearances?
Yeah, the Mark chapter 16 ends at 8, right?
Yeah, so the current canonical Mark ends at verse 8, and this is very well known. There's a few supporters of the longer ending, but they're few and far between, and the reasoning is just not reasonable in my opinion. As far as chapter 15, no, all the manuscripts contain chapter 15. But whatever proto-Mark was, I mean, this is a different discussion. Whatever proto-Mark was, I don't think had any similarity to canonical Mark, based on the descriptions of Papias of Hierapolis and based on Marcion's Evangelion. But I think what he's confused by is what I said about the crucifixion narrative, because the crucifixion narrative is at chapter 15. No, I said it was there in the earliest centuries, like by Basilides and other Alexandrian Docetists, but it was interpreted to be that it was Simon of Cyrene. Like the wording was very ambiguous. And Irenaeus actually opines upon this, saying that the heretics used the Docetists used the gospel according to Mark. Okay, so that was one of the reasons why. Yeah. So Mitchell, yep, I figured that's what you're talking about. No, I said the resurrection appearances are all those are manuscript variants, but the crucifixion is interpreted. Mark's account can actually be holistically interpreted to be that Jesus wasn't crucified at all. And so this is part of the reason why Mark was not very well liked in the early centuries at all. Much like Marcion's text, which I think was swallowed up into Mark. So every single manuscript of the Gospel according to Mark logically necessitates there being a manuscript within it of the Gospel of Marcion's Evangelion, because it is a more developed form of it. Okay, so Mark, there's not a single commentary, by the way, of the Gospel according to Mark until around the 11th century, until with Theophylact. He's the first person to ever write a complete commentary of the Gospel according to Mark, which is very, very telling, because we have commentaries of the Gospel according to John from the 160s to 180s by people like Heraclian of Ptolemy. We have complete commentaries of the Gospel according to Matthew by Origen himself and others. But Mark, nobody ever embarked upon actually writing a commentary of the Gospel according to Mark until the 11th century, and it was not copied. It was not copied very frequently. So we have maybe like 3 scraps prior to Sinaiticus. That's P88, P137, and P45, and they're all dating from the 3rd century, which is for the first gospel by consensus of scholars to have the least amount of attestation. There needs to be a plausible reason for that, and in my opinion, the most plausible reason is that it was identified with Marcion's gospel. In fact, John Mark's name literally spells out Marcion. So Ione Marco and Marcion are literally the same name, just in a different order. So John Mark, you can actually say is Marcion, very, very similar. And then there are his depictions in the book of Acts, which are very negative. John Mark is not spoken of very highly in the Gospel according to Mark, but he's spoken of very highly in Pseudo-Paul, like in Colossians and other passages. So there's a long history and a lot of evidence to show for this, in my opinion. And inshallah ta'ala, one day I'll publish something more extensive on it. Don't hold your breath. But so Marcion's gospel, this is how it was identified, but it does not have anything about a demiurge. Nothing. There's no, in any reconstruction you can find, and there have been plenty. So in Harnax, Zahns, Klinghart's, Nicolaides, Trobish's, Bedoun's, Dieter Roth, Judith Liu, all of these scholars who have embarked upon, Hoffman, Bauer, anybody who's ever undertaken like a very extensive monograph of Marcion's text have never disagreed upon that his text, it can be used very, very much in an orthodox way. So if he was a redactor, he was doing a much better job of actually sticking to whatever he received, better than Orthodox scribes did in later centuries. For example, adding resurrection appearances, right? Removing all the explicit references of Jesus' divinity, because we have them in textual variations basically for every single verse. John 1:18, 1 Timothy 3:16, 2 Peter 1:1, Jude chapter 5. And then they exist in translational variations like with Romans 9:5 and Titus, etc. And what's interesting again is that so how can I put this? There are no two church historians or theologians that ever disagreed about the existence or the non-existence of a Marcionite reading. Never. Across centuries and across many different authors, you'll never find, for example, Tertullian saying, in his text, he had this passage. And then in Epiphanius, they'll say, no, he didn't have this passage, which is amazing, because we don't have that for the New Testament. Irenaeus sometimes claims that a verse in Mark exists that is not in Mark. People like Origen, for example, when he's debating with Celsus, he says that Celsus Celsus is launching an attack at the Gospels by saying, launching an attack on Jesus, saying how could he be so prestigious and this highly revered and exalted figure when he was a carpenter, and Origen opines by saying there is no verse in the Gospels where it says that he's a carpenter, when in fact such a verse does exist in the Gospel according to Mark. It says, "Isn't this not the carpenter?" Some later scribes changed it to be the son of the carpenter, huios to teknon, and then some manuscripts say child, which is very, very strange because the words for carpenter and child are very similar. So yeah, teknon and tekton. So tekton would be the carpenter, and teknon would be children. And so a variation actually led to Origen of Alexandria saying that the verse doesn't exist anyway. So Marcion's text, in a sense, has more fidelity, has more textual fidelity and integrity than what we possess of the canonical Gospels. And so not only that,
at the very least consistent, and kept his gospel very, very consistent throughout, without any sort of variations.
Absolutely. So his antitheses, the preface, which Tertullian speaks about, is all against Matthean passages about the law, etc., etc. And yet, when you read his text, it's full of citations of the Old Testament. It's filled with praise of it has the transfiguration with Moses and Elijah. Right? It has all of these things. It has praise of John the Baptist. But there are things that it omits that people say are theologically motivated, but are actually not theologically motivated. So, for example, omitting the nativity and the birth narrative. How do we know that this is not a sign of heterodoxy? Because we have two Gospels that do the same thing. We have Mark and John that don't contain any of that. Okay, so very, very simple. If you're going to say he was orthodox by that, then he was if he was heterodox by doing that, then you have to say the same thing about Mark and John. Not only that, but there are some texts that were accepted by people like Irenaeus. So the so-called Diatessaron Vitation, people like Theodoret in the 5th or 6th centuries, says that all of the manuscripts of Tatian's Diatessaron, which is also called the Epistle according to the Hebrews in some patristic citations, they omitted the genealogy and the birth of Jesus. And Theodoret, he says that this is in line with Tatian's theology of omitting anything that has to do with the bodily state of Jesus. Basically, that he had an actual body and a corporeal existence. So you have somebody very early on who had the same type of text that omitted these things. Okay, so that's that. So all we are left with now is the problem of dating. Okay, and the problem of dating is even worse for our canonical Gospels, because our canonical Gospels don't have any history prior to Theophilus of Antioch and Irenaeus of Lyons. So prior to the 180s to 190s, which is around 20 to 30 years after Marcion would have been already dead. There's no mention of our canonical Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John prior to that period. Okay, although we have those same authors saying that Marcion's text existed as soon as he started preaching. So we know that he already had something called an Evangelion, which they are reading from. They had a manuscript from it, like Tertullian and Adamantius and Origen, and that it existed in somewhat of this form. They considered it to be so authentically Marcionite that they chose to attack it, knowing that the attack would actually have some type of effect on his followers. There would be no effect on his followers if he was attacking a straw man. So this is what they had, either a translation, which maybe Tertullian had it in Latin or Greek, but either a translation or an actual Greek text of Marcion's Evangelion, and it was called the Evangelion, and its author was known. Whereas for the Gospels, we don't have anything substantial or anything actually at all explicit prior to those two authors that I just named. What we have are traditions. What we have are Jesus' sayings that are attributed to the nebulous gospel. And there are references in Justin Martyr to multiple gospels written by either the apostles or followers of the apostles, which he calls the memoirs of the apostles. Dionysius of Corinth calls them the writings of the Lord. Right, and then you have the singular gospel in pretty much all the primitive church fathers, like First Clement and the Epistle of Barnabas, Second Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, etc., etc. And so Marcion, to an extent, is easier to date. He's easier to date because we know when he flourished, we know when he was preaching, we know when he was alive, and we know what his text was called. Manuscripts, on the other hand, don't do us much good for the Gospels, because nothing survives of a superscript outside of a flyleaf from the 3rd or 4th century of the Gospel according to Matthew, which is basically nothing. And the rest of the fragments are post-date Marcion by at least 100 years. So these are things like P75, P66, P52, P104,
wow,
P90. Yeah. So, yep. So in fact, Marcion's text is much more. It's easier to place it. Provenance is easier for Marcion's text, although it's not. It's harder to actually reconstruct it. In the agreements that they all have, they're pretty much. It's very easy to reconstruct. But then there are passages that the enemies or the adversaries of Marcion were silent about. And so scholars have to argue about when they're silent about a specific text, do we include it in the resurrection, in the reconstruction, or do we exclude it in the reconstruction, or do we include it with brackets or something different than that? And for me, at least, I like Marcus Vincent's approach to this. And he says that if you're following the rationale of a patristic author, and he is attacking Marcion on a specific passage, meaning saying that he rendered this passage this way, whereas in the true gospel it is like this. And if they are very keen on highlighting anything of substance and refuting it, then you can expect them to do the same thing with other texts. So if they're not doing that, then you can have a good level of confidence that his text was pretty much in line with canonical Luke. It's kind of circular, but it's kind of the best we have. And so there are reconstructions that range from 4,000 words. So these are reconstructions like Harnack and Zahn. And then there are reconstructions which expand it further, and they actually consider as attested passages that are not clearly either rebuked or mentioned by patristic authors. So these are like Klinghardt and Nicoletti. They have.
Timeout? Can I call a timeout for a second?
Yeah, go ahead. Why?
Okay. So just a couple of people in the chat, they're sort of struggling to just grasp all of the information that you're mentioning, because I think you're mentioning a lot of names and citations and then info. If you remove all of the citations, right, and
just they'll take my word for it then.
Essentially, well, they can revisit the whole thing, but generally speaking, if you can just in a minute sort of rephrase or just give a high level summary of what you've sort of touched upon and spoken about, I think that'll be good.
Okay. All right. So basically, we don't have Marcion's Evangelion, his gospel. We don't have it. What we have are citations and works of other authors from later than him, and some contemporary to him, like Justin Martyr, that attack him, and they choose to attack him by using his own works. Okay, this is like a very rational premise that we use even today. When we speak to Christians, we speak to them on their level, and we use the New Testament most of the time, right? Because this is something that they believe in. And so these authors, we can reconstruct Marcion's text, and when I say we, I mean scholars, by seeing how they are attesting to those passages. So Tertullian would say, Marcion wrote in his rendition of the Lord's Prayer, and he mentioned the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit. Okay, or Marcion renders the episode in the upper room when Jesus comes and says to his disciples, "Handle me and see, for a spirit hath no flesh and bones, as you see me have." Marcion's text says, "Handle me and see, for I am not a bodiless demon." Okay, and so that you can say that was part of his Evangelion, Luke chapter, whatever, and the Lord's Prayer would be here, and then they would. Tertullian speaks about his text extensively, so does Epiphanius, and so we can reconstruct it like that. But then there are passages that they're silent about, large chunks of text that they don't say whether it's in Marcion's gospel or not. And so there's like a little differing of methodology between scholars whether to include them in his Evangelion, because these patristic authors, they would have mentioned anything problematic or something that they can use against him had it been any different than canonical Luke, or had it omitted anything from canonical Luke. And then there are some people who say, no, we can't just assume that, so we should just leave it out and have the reconstruction as it is with the passages that are actually known from the authors as they cite them. And some people have a different perspective than that as well. But those are the two main perspectives. Is that clear?
Everyone following now? That was much better. Because if you with all the citations, I was just looking at the comments and like, dude, it's just overload.
Okay.
But yeah, like the reason, just to clarify from in Beyond Doubt's defense, it's needed because and we don't want to speak from a position of info, and then people are like, well, where did you get it from? Where's the citation? Where's the proof? Where
Yeah.
can I go and actually look at this stuff, right? So that's why it's critical for him to actually provide these references to ensure that when he's speaking, you guys can list them down or know them, or he's not speaking from his backside, right? So he's actually speaking with what he's read, and he's actually citing all of this sort of stuff.
Okay. So far I've spoken about Marcion's background, and again, this is very surface level. I'm not trying to stay too long. I have some chores to do, and again, yeah, I'm not a patristic scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but this is just from the books that I've read, from the articles that I've read. And so I've spoken about a little bit about Marcion's capabilities as a compiler, as a redactor, possibly, and as somebody who has a lot of means and resources where he grew up. I spoke about him being somebody who would have had free reign of travel during the Jewish revolts and the war between the Jews and the Romans, because the Jews were very easy to identify. They read typically from scrolls, from Torah scrolls, whereas the later Christians, they read from codices. They actually convened in synagogues. Christians had even convened sometimes in Roman courtyards, in stadiums, in temples, or even where Romans and pagans used to compile. They just called it an ecclesia, a gathering, and this got them in trouble later on. But this was Marcion would not have been very much like persecuted. Even people like Justin in his dialogue with Trypho, one of his letters, he says that we know that your kind, or your sect, or your race, he's talking to Trypho and the Jews, would love that you would be able to persecute us and hound us. But because of the ruling government, you cannot. Your hands are tied. So he's actually crediting Hadrianus and Pius and not Commodus later on, but the so-called good emperors of the mid-2nd century, of actually protecting Christians against the Jews. And Hadrian, to his discredit, literally banished at the end of the Jewish revolt, after suffering many losses during the time of Trajan and after that. He actually was able to stamp out the Jewish revolts and expelled all of them from Rome, and burned the Torahs. He actually had a mass burning of Torah scrolls, and replaced their bishops with who's in Jerusalem. At least they had a succession of bishops that were all circumcised Jews. Hadrian himself stepped in, according to Eusebius, and replaced their bishops, which go back to James the Just, with a Greek named Mark. Okay? The first uncircumcised bishop of the Church of Jerusalem was called Mark. And so he made sure that there is no more Jewish identity. So now you have a perfect breeding ground, a perfect cultivating ground for Marcion's message. And Marcion's message was the Pauline message, that the Old Covenant is no more, that it's all about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that you have to submit to the government, and all of these pro-Roman, Greek philosophy type of ideas. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically a little bit about his outlook, his upbringing. But what do we know specifically about why some scholars believe that his text is more primitive? And I've mentioned a few of those examples, why he's not a redactor at all. His text is received at a much earlier date. It's even easier to date given the nature of his text. But Marcion's Apostolos, for example, his his collection of Paul's writings, only had 10 letters. 10 letters. So it was the universally accepted 7. So that's 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, and 1 Thessalonians. And then he had the 3 letters, Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians. But he actually omitted the pastoral epistles. He omitted 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And this is very important, and the epistle to the Hebrews, which we now know is not Pauline at all, neither in its contents or its style. Even people like Origen said, who wrote it, nobody knows. Although Origen said the ideas are of the apostles, but the style is of someone more polished, right? And so he credits it with Luke. Some people credited it to Barnabas, or even Clement. First Clement was even proposed as the author of the epistle to the Hebrews. Where did I leave off? Oh, I left off at why the scholars who've done reconstructions, at least the majority of them, believe that Marcion's text came first. I discussed some of the intrinsic reasons for it, some of the reception reasons, but there's actually manuscript reasons for this as well. So, like I said, Marcion's Apostolos contained only 10 letters, right? Whereas it should have contained more. How do we know this? Titus and Hebrews if Marcion had available to him Titus and Hebrews, and he thought that they were Pauline, then he would have absolutely included them in his canon or in his apostolos, because they have the same general theology. Titus is a very long, not very long, it's a couple of chapters, but the majority of it is chastising the Jews, specifically the Jews of Crete, where they talk about don't believe in Jewish superstitions, don't get hung up on these quote-unquote useless, frivolous genealogies, wink wink, because Marcion didn't have a genealogy in his Evangelion, and Titus talks about it as well. Hebrews is full of like shadowing language, showing how you could reinterpret the Old Testament in light of Jesus, like kind of like trying to harmonize the messages of animal sacrifice with human sacrifice, etc., etc. And so if he had access to them, and they were considered Pauline, he would have included them. But he didn't include them because he was not self-serving. We know Hebrews existed because Clement quotes it, but he didn't include it because he did not think genuinely that it was from the hand of Paul. So he left it out. And the same thing with Titus. If Titus was available around his time, then he would have definitely included it, because it fits basically his theology. If he was a redactor, if he was a dishonest redactor, etc. First and Second Timothy also, while they are very anti-Marcionite, they just were not around. They were not composed by the 130s. And so the canonical Paul that Christians read in their text today has later introductions. The vast majority, Raymond Brown mentions in his book that around 93% of scholars believe that the pastoral epistles are post mid-2nd century compilations. So and Harnack says the same thing in his book, where he refuses to even discuss them as potential witnesses for Pauline theology. And in fact, it suggests that Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians would be more useful.
Just a quick question. Yeah. What are pastoral epistles?
Okay, pastoral epistles are 3 epistles. They are the epistles by Paul written to these pastors, basically his companions Titus and Timothy. Mm-hmm. So pastoral epistles are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus.
Yeah, continue. Yeah. Just wanted to clarify that.
And so basically, Marcion's apostolos, it coincides beautifully with modern critical scholarship. So it must be earlier than at least the collections that Irenaeus speaks about, because Irenaeus acknowledges all of those: Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, etc. Okay, and so does Tertullian. Okay? But these are and in fact, at least 2nd Timothy could not have been prior to Marcion, because it actually contains a veiled attack at Marcion. So 1 Timothy 6:20. Can you pull it up?
And you want the Greek?
Yeah. So this is supposedly Paul writing to Timothy to tell him to stay away from these types of ideas. But look at the words that are used.
Yeah, 1 second. I just need to burn with the effects. There you go. Is that okay?
Okay. Yep. So go down to the word where it says contradictions. So read the whole thing, just in English first.
O Timothy, the deposit committed to you, guard, avoiding profane, empty babbling, and opposing arguments falsely called knowledge.
Aha. So he's telling him, avoid babbling. So this is the babbling supposedly of the Montanists and the prophets. And the opposing arguments. What's the Greek word there?
Antithesis.
Antitheses. This is the header, the introduction of Marcion's gospel. It was called the Antitheses. The antitheses of the pseudenemou gnosis, the so-called Gnosticism, gnosis. This is actually
avoiding profane. So avoiding profane and the antitheses of Marcion, essentially,
of the so-called Gnostics.
There you go.
Yep. In fact, Irenaeus, before he named his book Against Heresies, the initial name was a refutation of the so-called knowledge. Same thing, pseudonemou gnosis. So 1 Timothy seems to be at a much later date when the Gnostics were already writing, and this is kind of like a play on words, telling them to stay away from those individuals. Okay, so Marcion's apostolos did not have those 3 books, which are now universally acknowledged to be forgeries, and did not have the book which is early, Hebrews, but was not attributed to Paul. And he could have used all of them outside of the anti-Marcionite to 1st and 2nd Timothy.
Well, so 1st and 2nd Timothy are essentially forgeries that existed after the fact. And what was the third one?
And Titus.
And Titus.
Yes. And also, how do we know this? Because our earliest codices of Paul's letters don't have those letters. So P46 is missing the pastorals. It's missing 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, along with some 2nd Thessalonians as well. So that is from circa 200, or perhaps a little bit later, or a little bit earlier. They don't have the pastoral epistles. Our second most complete codex of Paul's letters, Codex Vaticanus, which is slightly earlier than Sinaiticus, but contrary to popular opinion, doesn't have the pastoral epistles. Doesn't have 1st, 2nd Timothy or Titus. Okay? Our earliest Coptic fragment, it was given an LDAP number, it doesn't have a Gregory Allen number, but there's a Coptic codex of Paul's letters, which also omits those, and it's the earliest translational witness to Paul's letters. It doesn't have those codices. It doesn't have those books, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So we have philological studies that have shown that the language is much different than Paul, the theology is much different than Paul, etc., etc. We have manuscript studies that converge at that point, and then we have internal arguments as well. And so Marcion had a very early collection of Paul's letters, at least Paul's letters. But what about his Evangelion? What about his gospel? There's a lot of research done on this, and some of our earliest citations of the gospels, so this is from like Pseudo-Ignatius to the Smyrnaeans, which is sometime in the middle to the late 2nd century. Tertullian and Gregory of Nazianzus and some others, they attest to Marcion's reading, even when the canonical reading is more suitable for their doctrine. Origen as well. So, for example, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you have the what are called, I don't know how to simplify this, but they're called the Western non-interpolations. Okay? So they are verses from the end of the Gospel according to Luke that scholars now today either think are complete forgeries or are at least dubious. So this is the consoling of the angel that came to Jesus during the Garden of Gethsemane when he was sweating drops of blood. His statements saying, "God, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Okay. And some other Lucan either additions or omissions, depending on which manuscript you're looking at. Marcion's text was missing these. And what do we know? The earliest manuscripts don't have these. Like P75 omits these texts, and P75 is clearly not a Marcionite text. It lines up with, basically very well with the neutral text of Codex Vaticanus. So it comes from a different stream, and yet it has very unique Marcionite readings. And then we have, for example, like I mentioned earlier, the meeting in the upper room. The meeting in the upper room. In the canonical text, you read, handle me and see, for a spirit hath no flesh and bones. Spirit hath no flesh and bones.
Correct.
In Marcion's text, this would have been much better for him, because he was credited, he was attacked as a Docetist. He was attacked as a Docetist that didn't believe that Jesus Christ had an actual physical body. And so the canonical reading for Marcion would have been much more beneficial for his case. But instead, he chose a reading, or not chose, but he reflected a reading that says, handle me and see, for I am not a bodiless demon. And Jesus was not even accused of being some kind of spiritual demon at all. So it's a much harder reading. In Latin, this principle of choosing between variants is very well established, and it's called the Lectio Difficilor Protor. The harder reading is the one to be preferred. And coincidentally, this is the reading of Ignatius of Antioch, when Eusebius, who lived around from the 90s to the maybe 115s. Some people place him later, but very early. When Eusebius is quoting from his epistle to the Smyrnaeans, this is the only fragment that he provides. Although Eusebius opines on it by saying, I don't know where he got this from. But it comes from Marcion's text. Origen quotes it and attributes it to what's called the Doctrina Petru, a lost document that's supposed to have been called the Doctrines of Peter. Also an early document.
Crazy, man.
Right? And there is the issue of his order of Pauline epistles. In the Eastern Church, the earliest order of Paul's epistles followed the exact order of Marcion's canon, starting with Galatians, then Romans, then 1 Corinthians, so on and so forth. And even those had pro-Marcionite prologues. That'll take way too long to dissect. But suffice to say that the Gospels had anti-Marcionite prologues, and the epistles of Paul had pro-Marcionite prologues. Marcion was, again, he was catalyzing Paul's message throughout the Roman world.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are cases of actual manuscripts that we found, like again P69 and P127, that are very early, either from Luke or Mark, that confirm the same readings as Marcion's canon or Marcion's Evangelion. And so when all of this data converges, I think it is the most reasonable hypothesis that Marcion's text came before. And then there are arguments that I'm not capable of elucidating or articulating because they have to deal with very advanced style of metric analysis. So this is actually like comparing the frequency of each separate category of grammatical expressions. So prepositions, conjunctions, long words, small words, how things are said in phrase, the existence or the non-existence of idioms in his text. And basically the conclusion of people who are doing this work, so Mark Bilby and some of his team, they say that Marcion's text shows primitivity on every single level, meaning that his DNA is always consistent, whereas when you compare that same distribution of words in the other Gospels, it's more random. It's more random. And so it's impossible for a redactor, if Marcion was a redactor, to take Luke and treat it like a surgical exercise, removing all of the single, very harmless and innocuous prepositions and conjunctions, and leaving a very unique and harmonious singular author type of text. No one can do that, especially without the assistance of computers. And this is something that I actually discussed with Jack Bull in my interview earlier today about the same thing being done in Ignatian studies. How we know that the Syriac recension is more authentic is because of the same phenomena, that his text shows a more coherent distribution of literary DNA, basically literary DNA. Okay, so that's one argument, and there's so much more, but I don't know if I should stop it here or not.
No, if you want to keep going, dude, that last bit was very, very interesting.
Yeah, so if you guys are interested in this, go to the Patristica. It's called Patristica. It's a YouTube channel by Jack Bull, Marcus Vincent, and Mark Bilby, where they actually take you through the software and how they calculate these things and the data that they input and their conclusions as well. They also even have their rough draft of Paul's of the Apostolos, so Marcion's collection of Paul's letters, and the exact text that it's in, and you can access it there for free as well. So you can compare it to what we have now of Paul, which is another argument. So in Marcion's collection, he did not have the letter to the Ephesians. He had the letter, but it was not called the letter to the Ephesians. It was called the letter to the Laodiceans. And the term Paul, a messenger of Christ to the church in Ephesus, so to ha ecclesia in Ephesus, is actually missing from all the earliest manuscripts. So if you read, for example, the letter to the Ephesians from Codex Sinaiticus or from P46, you won't see that phrase. And so the entire letter, you don't even know who he's addressing. And Marcion, coincidentally, again, did not have it to the Ephesians. He had it to the Laodiceans. So what are the odds that Marcion, again, is preempting modern scholarship? Okay, his letter, according to his epistle, his version of the epistle to the Romans, is missing the last two chapters. And you find this exactly in some of the Western Latin manuscripts, that they're missing the last two chapters of Romans. And the ones that have it sometimes have the doxologies in so many different places. The introduction to the letter of the Romans is not called to the church at Rome, but rather to my friends. And that's the same way that you find it in those group of manuscripts in the Western tradition that show very old readings. And so Marcion's text again and again seems to reflect at every turn a very early version that is not adequately explained by a redactor changing them, but rather vice versa, by a person who sees Marcion's text, sees deficiencies in it, and tries to make it more palatable or more clear.